Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. Today, recording and transmissioning live from the People's Climate Meeting in Middelfart. And for the first episode, I have Sebastian with me from SLOW. Welcome to the show, Sebastian. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frederik. Nice to be here.
Really excited that you could make it. Sebastian, the reason why I wanted you to come on the show was because you have recently gotten a verification from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And I think that really calls for celebration, and I wanted to promote that and promote SLOW in it. So I wanted to talk about that. But before we dive into it, can you give the folks that have not heard about SLOW a brief introduction to what is it SLOW actually is?
Yes, of course. So SLOW is we're a coffee producer. Contrary to many coffee companies that roast coffee, we actually produce coffee. So we're 160 employees, 15 in Europe, and the rest of the team is on ground in the coffee operations in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Laos, working, on the coffee field. And that is rare. It's complicated. But what we managed to do was take a value chain where coffee changed hands 15 to 20 times from the coffee field until you drink the coffee. That's problematic because you lose, visibility what actually goes on. So the transparency in the value chain disappears. But it's also a problem for the farmer. They have limited market access, and basically they can't have a decent living on the income from coffee. So what we did was we fully integrated the value chain and connect the farmer with a coffee drinker in Europe. Capturing all this value from middlemen, we could redistribute it back to what we prioritize. So that's improving livelihoods for communities. It is improving biodiversity and nature and carbon. So that's the short introduction to SLOW. How we do it is by growing coffee in forest.
So where normally when I buy coffee, I get it from a monoculture field where they grow only one crop, they grow only coffee, they spend a significant amount of water, fertilizer, pesticides, fungicides, and maybe even mechanical labor to produce the coffee in the most coffee that's produced in the world. What's the situation in a normal coffee field, and what's the situation in a SLOW coffee field?
So all of that is probably true for most. It's not all origins that use irrigation, but monoculture, you're relying on input. So the chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and so forth, and it is a problem, and so that's on soil and people, but when we produce monoculture coffee, we've removed forest. So it's a huge driver for deforestation. If we take the deforestation in the tropical belt, 6 commodities are causing 80% of the deforestation, coffee being one of them. So that's a problem. If we take the chemical part, there's a recent study from this summer from a PhD in Copenhagen University referring to coffee production in Brazil. More than 300 different types of chemicals are used to optimize for yield. What we know is that people get sick. The workers are, affected by this. Their health is affected by this. A significant part of the chemicals are not allowed in the EU.
But they are, so the chemicals are not allowed in the EU, but they are, however, used in the production of crops that are imported in the EU.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, there's kind of a backdoor, you could say, to using the chemicals and importing it, importing a product that has the chemicals as part of the development of the product. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's used to, get the additional kilo of coffee out of the field. So we're overexploiting the farms and just adding. And, people are, heard from this. Habitats are removed. Soil will be degraded. Fresh water is affected. But we get the extra coffee.
Yeah, so we get slightly higher yields, but at an extremely high cost in reality.
That's what we argue, and that's why that slows the opposite. So we would, take a monoculture, regenerate it, plant forest in multiple strata layers, multiple tree species. So we use 20 different tree species per hectare.
So it's actually because when you're looking at coffee, it comes from a berry that grows on a bush. And you found out that this is a bush that naturally occurs in a forest setting, right? And then you were kind of reverse engineering from there and looking at what would it take to actually make this plant thrive.
Yeah, I don't think that we did it. I mean, that was the way coffee was produced. So we're just going old school. We're just going back to the roots of how was coffee produced initially. And that I mean, there are many benefits of this. So one is, of course, we have carbon capture. We'll get back to the SBTI or science-based target. But if we regenerate a forest in multiple strata levels with a variety of tree species, fruit trees, and some of the endangered tree species, we create a habitat for wildlife, insects, birds, and so forth, and we monitor it. And secondly, the soil. I mean, suddenly we're actually regenerating the health of the soil, the water holding capacity, the fresh water, and so there are a number of good arguments for actually doing it the natural way.
So it really comes down to, you keep going back to strato layers. What is a strato layer?
Yeah. So imagine a forest in different, heights. So coffee being around just below 2 meters, and then you have the second strata level layer up to 5 meters, and then up to 8 meters, and above 12 meters. So in order to mimic a natural as forest as possible, because you could argue that we could have the shade in one. So shade-grown coffee is a phenomenon. So that usually one species, tree species, creating a shade cover. That's good for coffee production, and it's somewhat good for carbon capture. But we lack the biodiversity dimension, because that's not. I mean, it's equivalent to your lawn outside. It's from a biodiversity point of view, it's a desert, right? So you need the varieties in species, tree species, to create a habitat for wildlife.
So it really has to do with farming, or industrialized farming, traditionally being in 2 dimensions only. You're engaging a 3rd dimension and adding these layers. Into the.
So we're introducing intercropping. So we, on our farms, we produce avocado, banana, macadamia nuts, all jackfruit, and huge variety of fruits and nuts, and that's good for biodiversity, but it's good for the families because it creates a diversification in their income stream.
So I think that's really interesting. So let's zoom in on that. So normally when you're producing coffee, if you're a farmer, you have a coffee farm and you produce some coffee, and that's the only crop you have. So you're really dependent on the harvest of that coffee and being able to sell that at a certain time.
Yeah.
But here you're kind of adding in more crops that are both protecting the coffee crop from getting too much sun or too little water, too little nutrition or nitrogen. And on top of that, you're also allowing them to have another cash crop so that they can actually sell those crops in the market and have a livelihood for a longer time. So what is the structure? If you have an example of a slow farmer, how is the relationship to slow? Are they employed by slow, or do they own the crop field themselves? Or what's the structure?
Before I answer that question, let me just reflect on the income, because we just started out in Vietnam. So we have this grant, and we're working with WWF to regenerate smallholder farmers' coffee production. And I just returned from there 2 weeks back. And when I meet the farmers, more than 90% of their income is coffee.
Wow.
And I was visiting a female farmer. She has 2 hectares of coffee, or she had, and a third of it was washed out in a landslide.
Wow.
2 years back. I mean, that's a third of the income overnight gone. Monoculture, and that shows the vulnerability in their income and how much we've destroyed the soil, so we're exposed to landslides.
So it basically, to relate it to our reality, where most of us are probably office workers, if I'm not mistaken, it corresponds to us taking out 4 months' salary
Forever.
Of a year, and just because of weather.
Yeah.
That's quite dramatic.
It is quite dramatic. And that, I mean, now we will help her do terracing on the 0.6 hectares that was washed out. And in 5
maybe
years,
terracing.
So now it's like just a very steep slope, and what you build, considered stairs, like you've seen rice paddies.
Yeah.
So we'll build equivalent to this, and then plant the trees to ensure that the soil will help.
Stay in place.
Exactly, yeah. And then coffee will be back in 5 years. So that's a project, but it wasn't even possible for her to do it on her own. I mean, she just lost a third of her income, and it costs quite a lot to actually reestablish what was washed away. Due to the terracing on a steep slope, it's heavy machinery required. So that's something we can help with. And then coming back to your question, we're working with smallholders. That is one track of slow. They own the land. It is their land. If they have agroforestry systems today, we will help them develop it even further. So that will be about implementing fruit tree programs. It could be beehives and so forth. And then we consult with them and train them to increase productivity in an organic production. So we have a team working with the smallholders, but it's their decision, it's their land, and we offer a program where we want to buy the coffee if they are, adapting the slow methods. So that's about, no deforestation. It's about improving for biodiversity and converting to organic certified coffee.
So basically, that sounds really interesting. That you're building an incentive for them to transform their production, but during a timeline. So what does that look like for you as a buyer in the other end? Do you then take the coffee off of their hands that is not yet certified organic, not yet certified slow, because they're committing to the process, and then you sell that in the market as normal coffee or unbranded conventional coffee?
Yeah, it's a journey, and it's called slow for a reason. This transition is not a quick fix. It takes, we want to talk about carbon, we want to talk about biodiversity and all of these things, but it actually starts with livelihood. So we need to create a decent living in order to actually make a transformation, and that's what we're delivering. So by partnership, long-term partnerships, we can create an increase in income. We know that. We can diversify the income. We can create stability. So we're paying advance payments before harvest and so forth, because it brings stability to the family. Once we've covered the social side of this, it's a lot easier to engage on biodiversity and carbon. But it's a systemic shift, and it needs to be balanced with all 3 components. And as a consequence, we cannot optimize for yield. So that's the thing we need to accept. that from the coffee crop will go down. We will create other crops that will create prosperity and for the family at least. I mean, at least a better development, and we will win on carbon and biodiversity.
And I think that the win on carbon is probably one of the easiest things to understand. That if you put it quite bluntly, right now when you purchase 1 kilo of normal coffee, it emits 3 kilos of CO2. And if you purchase a kilo of slow coffee, you're actually sequestering or binding or taking out of the atmosphere 6 kilos of CO2.
Yes.
Is that correctly understood?
That is correct in our SBTi baseline. So you're referring to, we've just been validated by SBTi.
Congratulations.
Thank you very
That's
much.
amazing.
I mean, it's within scope 1, 2, 3 and FLAG, so that covers forest and agriculture practices. We have a plan to become net zero. And what's even more interesting is that our baseline was net negative. So we are actually across our full value chain. In our baseline year, we had what will be equivalent to 6 kilos of carbon capture per kilo coffee sold. That's a difference of 9 kilo compared to Concito's climate database. And it's 9 kilos a lot. And I just did the math. It's actually equivalent to 300 balloons of carbon. I mean, that's something.
That's something. Every time you buy a kilo.
For every bag of coffee.
Yeah, wow.
300 balloons.
Yeah.
I mean, my kid's birthday is actually next week. I'm tired after 5.
Yeah.
So I think that counts for something.
It's a lot of CO2.
And it is a lot. It puts it in perspective. And all you have to do is, change the bag of coffee. Shouldn't be that hard
And
decision.
So I think now in the Sustainable Healthcare podcast, we're communicating a lot to an audience inside the healthcare sector. And I think it's safe to say that the majority of them drink coffee. But let's say when they go to the coffee machine in the hospital or in their workplace and they hit the cappuccino on the coffee machine or Americano or whatever they're drinking, what would they have to do to make sure that they had slow coffee in there or something else that is regenerative?
Well, I mean, I have a phone number, or we can share it. And that would be the first choice. I think that it starts with conversations with your suppliers. It's if you're committed to science-based target, I think there's more than 3,000 companies globally committed. This will affect your climate accounting. So it will go straight into your scope 3. And I think that's a starting point. Engage with suppliers. Try to capture the quick wins. How can we actually? I think that the procurement discipline is changing. So back in the days, it was about price and quality. I think we won't get away from price and quality being important. But with the EU regulations coming in on CSRD and so forth, you have to report on it. You need to report on biodiversity impact. You need to report on workers in the value chain, wastewater pollution, and so forth. So the conversation and the procurement will shift to be aligned with Paris.
Yeah, because the pressure is coming on the suppliers now, right? And the purchasing directors are looking for quick wins. I think that's one thing that I see a lot in our work, at least, that at the end of the day, you have a carbon budget and someone is being held responsible to it. So if you can take something that's a net driver for emissions and turn it into a carbon capture factor, then
it could potentially justify the milk, right?
Yeah.
But I think that we're past the point where it's a carrot and a stick, and the time for carrot is pretty much gone. Now the stick's coming with regulations. And that will change the conversation. It will change how we engage with our supply chain, because suddenly we are not only responsible for what we do in-house, but we're responsible for upstream and downstream. And I think that will matter.
You're talking a lot about regeneration and biodiversity, and when we're looking at a coffee forest, in as such. And we're talking about biodiversity. What kind of biodiversity is it that you can help here? Because one thing is, of course, the plants that you're planting. You have some different tree species. You have some different cover crops. But I suppose you're not bringing in new species. Well, how does that work then? I mean, are you attracting threatened species, or how does this play into sort of the global biodiversity problems?
So that's a good question. And I think the first step in answering this would be understanding what is biodiversity. So that's pretty much all life, right? So that's from fungus to trees and mammals and so forth. So it's a full spectrum. And by what we can affect is the trees we plant, and part of that. So there's 22,000 endangered tree species in the world. Part of the ones that are, we would never introduce new species or invasive species, but the endangered local species, they're incorporated into our manual for planting trees as the equivalent in fruit trees.
Yeah.
So that will, and we know what it will impact. Some of the trees will attract birds, certain bird species and insects and so forth. And by combining these, we can create a mimic as natural as forest as possible. So that's on the forest level. On the soil, the humus, that's the next thing. How can we actually improve that? So we're measuring on soil organic matter, water holding capacity, nutrition, pH values, and so forth. And we can actually see it develops in the right direction.
How much time does it take? I mean, if you take over a monoculture field and it's completely degenerated, how much time does it take for it to build up from nothing to something? What's the scale that we're looking at?
Well, I mean, that's a moving target, right? So it would take 10 years to have something you would consider forest in different strata levels. We cannot plant all strata levels at the same time. So we're planting in waves. And then a few years later, we can plant the next wave and then the subsequent wave. So it will take quite some time. We can see improvements. So what we're doing, we're experimenting with bioacoustics, for instance. So that's
okay. Cool.
So we do recordings on a farm, and then we use AI to identify species and number of each identified species.
Wow.
So those are the things that we're experimenting with currently, because we need to make this scalable. Up until this point, it's been bird studies, and that's difficult across 1,000 farmers.
So you need a biologist to sit down and look for birds.
We did that. So this in the spring we did both the bioacoustics and at the same time we did a control study with as a bird study, and then we can calibrate the models and hopefully at one point we have enough reliable data models that can actually tell us about the progress on biodiversity. It's a super complicated topic, and if you ask SPTN, the biodiversity component of that is not ready yet. So what's ready is soil or land and fresh water. Then we're waiting for biodiversity and we're waiting for ocean. But we've started the journey and we're experimenting to get the initial data points and try to see how can we automate as much as possible.
But when we're looking at the soil and the soil health, in year 1, year 2, year 3, how long does it take before you see a measurable difference in the two?
We don't have
practices?
the data yet.
We don't know.
It's too early to have meaningful data so far. So this is the second harvest on the first conversions we're doing, and so we need more time. We can see progress, but it's not data that we're ready to share because it's still. I mean, the jury's still out. What I can say is we're measuring more than 100 data points for each farmer. Even for every smallholder, we have more than 100 data points, and that comes across, productivity, social data, crop types, biodiversity, carbon, and so forth across the board. And it's really important to So we have a lot of primary data in this, and we need to automate this to be able to continue the growth that is needed to actually make a real impact. Currently, a lot of this is manual, and this is something that we need to automate, and AI, satellite data, and other data sources will help us in the near future to actually have these collected.
How much data do you think normally, if you look at other commodity trading platforms or other ventures that are trading coffee, how many data points do you think it's normal to have on a smallholder?
What do you think?
I would say kilos of harvest or something.
And price?
And price.
That would be my best guess.
Wow. So you're really going deep on developing the
And I'm not
the
even sure
knowledge
they would have it on Polygon level or on a smallholder level.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know.
So if now we've gone over how we traditionally or conventionally produce coffee in monocultures. With Slow, you found a way to grow in different layers and add cash crops in for the farmers so that they build a livelihood faster. And on the side of the coffee production, so they can sustain themselves. And we've talked about how Science-Based Targets Initiative is looking at this as actually a net negative, so a way for doing carbon capture actively. If we're looking at the whole supply chain of agricultural produce, and we're looking at the healthcare sector specifically, what we're using the most agricultural produce for is for drug production. So for most drugs, we need sugar in order to produce it. And for that sugar to come to life, you need a farmer somewhere to produce it. So let's say that you were a pharma company and you were reliant on an agricultural input. What would you do to help those farmers regenerate from a monoculture cropping? What would be the first steps?
I think the first step is actually understanding the reality. So if you look at World Economic Forum, they released some data late last year stating that 50% of our GDP is relying on natural resources.
50%?
50%
of our GDP is on natural resources.
That's depending on natural resources.
Wow.
And the way that we use it now, we're using it at 4 planets per year, equivalent in natural resources. That won't work.
Yeah.
Do the math.
It doesn't add up.
Let's say you could. I've met people arguing that Slow is a hippie company and tree huggers. Mm-hmm. You could take the counter argument saying, hey, if this is true and coffee is not able to be produced in 2045, that's another World Economic Forum data point, then we're actually the opposite. We're risk averse. We're actually trying to protect our business by transforming it into being in balance with the planetary boundaries and the reality of the climate development. And I think if you look at farmer, they're as much depending on natural resources as I am as a coffee grower. So that realization is probably the starting point. Then I think the realization needs to be communicated very clearly to procurement, because it's a value chain conversation. It's your suppliers, that's your footprint. It's not in your HQ. You have very nice garden, and there's even some biodiversity stuff going out on the roof and outside. It's all good. But it's equivalent to considering your scope 1 the problem in carbon. It's not the problem, it's a scope 3. So engage your suppliers, identify, use the tools. WWF made a biodiversity risk filter tool. Type in your supplier's address and they would tell you what's the pressure on biodiversity in this specific area. Start that conversation. Start co-developing. How do you want to, get aligned with the planetary boundaries? And then if it won't work, look for alternatives.
So first level is probably to give a mandate to the procurement organization to build the transparency and to start those supplier engagements.
Do your baseline.
And I think part of that baseline, a lot of the suppliers are probably not even the growers. So I imagine that you will have like an entire...
It will be the 15, 20 steps that's in the coffee industry, or even more. So it is really understand your pressure on the planetary boundaries, engage in your conversation with suppliers, understand your baseline, and then make a plan, co-develop, how do we actually change this? That will be, the way probably to address this. But it's a journey of more than 1,000 steps, and it really take the first step and then continue.
And probably also insist to get a line of sight on the seed level of where is the seed actually going into the ground to become a crop.
That's a good point. I think we're going to talk a lot about primary data in the coming years, because the reporting that we need to deliver is relying on this. And therefore you would probably be willing to pay for primary data rather than data that's been through X middlemen.
Because those 15 middlemen, I mean, it's basically commodity trading, right? Where you buy an orange for 1 and you sell it for 1.1, and then someone buys it at 1.1 and sells it for 1.2, and then this becomes speculation basically all the way until the end consumer has it. And there was a reason why that came, in order to sustain livelihoods and be able to place orders on crops early on. But the way I understand that you do it in Slow is that you make an agreement between basically the farmer and the end drinker, in principle, right? So how many years do you make those contracts for that?
So it differs, but usually 5 to 7 years. And it the thing is, they're only buying coffee, but what they're actually doing is delivering the foundation for a green transition, and we cannot fast track nature. So we talked about forest 10 years. We do 5 to 7 years. So we will be, some steps down the road after, at the end of contract. But it's not possible to rush this.
Yeah, it's kind of Warren Buffett says you cannot make a baby by making 9 women pregnant in 1 month. And then, I think there's a good point in this slow process that we need, and also the longevity in the contracts, that we really need to have a view to a more distant horizon and not the next quarter report if we want to succeed in this. That we do need to take it slow. But what really fascinates me is that it's possible to do this and still be in a comparable price range. I mean, it's not 4 or 5 times the price of conventional coffee. So
no, I want to be competitive. It's a necessity to achieve scale.
Yeah.
So we would not have started. So we did a feasibility study for half a year before we incorporated in 17, and then we incorporated in 18. And the 2 major points we need to identify: is it possible to bypass all the middlemen, and can we do a green transition with the farmers? Because if we couldn't tick off those boxes, we would not have a sustainable business financially. It's not an NGO. We need to compete in a business environment where everyone talks sustainability, no one pays for it. And we still need to build a business that will attract very large quantities to drive the necessary change and transformation in the global south.
So what are, can you share some of the clients that you have managed to get on board on this mission?
I don't think I can share a full client list. I think that would probably be inappropriate, but some of them are known already. We're very happy with the partnership we have with Maersk. So we've made a long-term contract with Maersk. We bought a monoculture farm, and we've started the regenerative journey. We're reporting on it. Coffee is served. Everyone's happy and excited, and they share some updates on LinkedIn from time to time, on other communication channels internally and externally. So I think that this is a good example of how a commodity is changed. I mean, it's not just a commodity, but it's a communication tool. It's about talent attraction, talent retention. It's about the good example of how do we work with biodiversity. What's a tangible carbon solution? And a number of our clients are using the coffee station as the broadcaster of these kind of topics.
Yeah, of course. So people also want to stay longer if they have that applied meeting. I think it's really fascinating how you took such a global firm basically that is probably used to buying conventional coffee before that, and then managed to get them on board on a long-term project like this, where they're actually having a physical footprint on the land and on the land use, and making sure that it's turned around. I think that's really, really cool.
They had really high ambitions in this, so they were an excellent partner for us in problem solving and developing the solution. I think that we had good conversations before, aligning on expectation, raising the bar. They pushed even further, and now we're implementing, and so far everyone's happy, and trees are growing.
And that's just amazing. And if somebody else would want to do that, will they need to put in as much work and effort as they did, or is there also a turnkey slow solution where you say, I just want X amount of coffee per year?
Of course. We covered, we want to be a democratic product, accessible for all. You don't have to be 100,000 employees. So this is for the many, not for the few, because there's not enough of, Maersk to drive the change needed. Mm-hmm. So we need to, we're not at the point where we're saying no to small clients. We want all clients. We want to be accessible for everyone to make an ethical choice. And it's quite simple. If I ask you, how would you justify to your newborn that you chose a coffee that with a delta of 9 kgs carbon per kilo? Mm-hmm. If everything else being equal, price and quality same, carbon profile significant differently. How could you justify not going for the -6?
Yeah, especially if it's available. And I think that's where we're struggling right now, right? Because you only have the produce that you're producing.
So it's a B2B product at this point, but I think that every company delivers coffee to the employees for meetings and so forth. And last time I checked, we do not have all companies as clients. So there's still potential, and that's at one point. It will be a hygiene factor that within your workplace. They've made the reductions that's possible, mm-hmm. and here's an easy win.
Yeah, would you rather scale slow to satisfy that market demand, or distribute the slow model?
No, I'm all for distributing the model. We're open source. If you want to copy it tomorrow, I'm happy to share all the notes, because we don't have time.
Yeah, you literally would not have time to go out and convert that yourself with your, even though it's a large organization and impressive what you build.
Yeah, we're happy to share all manuals. We're happy to problem solve on this. We don't have time.
I think that's the perfect end note. Thanks a lot for coming on the show again, Sebastian. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be back.
For listening in.